In the spring of 1944, the German High Command was baffled. Across the muddy battlefields of Italy, their most feared scout cars, the elite Sd.Kfz 222, armored, fast, and deadly, were disappearing. But they weren't being blown up by bazookas or crushed by tanks. No, they were being found upside down, wheels spinning in the air, completely intact, as if they had been flipped over by an invisible giant. Meanwhile, back at the U.S. 34th Division headquarters, the top brass wasn't celebrating. They were furious. They were hunting for a man to court-martial. Why? Because the weapon responsible for this chaos wasn't in any official manual. It cost exactly $0 to make, and the man who invented it, a corporal named James Jimmy Dalton, had been explicitly ordered to stop using it. This is the incredible, almost unbelievable story of how a kid from the Railyards of Indiana used 30 feet of rusted wire to save an entire company, rewrite the rules of engagement, and why the U.S. Army tried to bury his story for over 20 years. To understand what happened, you have to understand the hell that was Italy in 1944. The soldiers called it the Purple Heart Valley. The Germans were dug in on the high ground at Monte Cassino, looking down on the Americans stuck below. It was a nightmare of mud, rain, and sheer vertical cliffs. But the snipers weren't the biggest problem. The real killers were the eyes of the German army, the 222 scout car. Imagine this. You're huddled in a muddy foxhole, freezing, when out of the thick morning fog, this armored vehicle appears. It's moving at 15 miles per hour. Its 20mm cannon blazing, tearing your position to shreds. And just as quickly as it appeared, it vanishes back into the fog, long before you or your squad could even get a bazooka loaded. These cars were phantoms, and they were bleeding the American lines dry. Corporal Jimmy Dalton watched his best friend, a kid named Eddie Kowalski, get cut down by one of these machines. He felt the helpless rage of knowing his M1 Garand rifle was completely useless against 2 inches of German steel. The Army's official solution: hunker down and wait for resupply. But in the mud of Italy, waiting was just another word for dying. Jimmy Dalton wasn't going to wait. To understand Dalton's genius solution, you have to understand where he came from. He wasn't a warrior in the traditional sense. He was a railroad switchman from Gary, Indiana. By the time he was 17, his entire world was about rigging massive, multi-ton train cars. In the rail yards, you learn things they don't teach you in basic training. You learn that if a cable snaps under tension, people die. You learn that if a single coupling pin is loose, the whole system can cascade into a catastrophic wreck. So, when Jimmy Dalton looked at the German war machine, he didn't just see a tank. He saw a system on wheels, and every system has a vulnerability. He realized that every vehicle, no matter how armored, has a center of gravity, and every axle, no matter how tough, has a breaking point. He became obsessed. At night, under the cover of darkness, he would crawl out to measure the axles of destroyed German vehicles. He found his magic number: 14 inches. That was the height of the axle from the ground. He knew, with the certainty of a man who understood physics in his bones, that if he could just catch a moving axle at exactly 14 inches with enough tension, physics would do what a bullet couldn't. On the night of March 10th, the illegal experiment began. Dalton slipped out of his foxhole after midnight. He wasn't carrying grenades or a rifle. He was carrying 2 rusted shovels and a coil of scavenged barbed wire he'd stolen from a supply dump. This was a direct violation of orders. His own captain, a man named Morrison, had pointed a finger in his face just days earlier. "Dalton, you use any more unauthorized gear, and I'll strip your stripes and send you to the stockade." This was borderline mutiny. Out in the darkness of no man's land, he could hear a distant German patrol. He froze, the freezing mud seeping through his clothes. It worked fast, driving the shovels deep into the muddy earth on opposite sides of a narrow dirt track. Then he took the wire, wrapping it around the shovel handles and pulling it taut, so tight it hummed in the cold night air like a low guitar string. He measured it carefully, 14 inches off the ground. He then painstakingly buried the wire under a thin layer of mud and silt. It was perfectly invisible. He'd created a 15-mile-per-hour tripwire. Now, all he had to do was wait, hoping a German car would hit it before his own officers found him and threw him in the brig. 6:47 a.m. The fog was as thick and wet as cotton. The low growl of a Maybach engine grew louder. Through the mist, the sap of a 222 scout car appeared. The German commander was visible in the opened-up turret, looking bored, scanning the American lines for a target. He never saw the shovels. He never saw the wire. The car was moving at its standard patrol speed, about 15 miles per hour. That's 22 feet per second. When the front right tire passed over the wire, the axle hit it. Think about the physics of that moment. All the forward momentum of a four-ton vehicle meeting an immovable steel cable. The wire didn't snap. It dug into the axle, locking the front wheel instantly. But the rear of the car was still pushing forward with thousands of pounds of force. With the front end anchored to the ground, that rear momentum had nowhere to go but up. In a split second, the car lurched, its nose digging into the mud as its tail flipped straight over its head. It landed upside down with a sickening crunch of metal. The stunned German crew was trapped inside. In less than 90 seconds, without firing a single shot, Jimmy Dalton had done what the entire 34th Division had failed to do for weeks. He captured an enemy crew, neutralized a scout car, and gave his fellow soldiers a fighting chance. Word of the Dalton method spread through the trenches like a virus. It wasn't in any field manual. But suddenly, every GI in Italy started carrying extra shovels and hoarding bits of wire. The effect was astonishing. German casualties from flipped cars mounted, but more importantly, a sense of paranoia crept into their patrols. They started calling the unseen threat the invisible claws of the American lines. Fearing these invisible traps, they scaled back their dangerous patrols, giving the Americans critical breathing room. But you won't find Corporal Dalton's name on a Medal of Honor citation. The Army couldn't officially recognize his invention. To do so would be to admit that a corporal with a shovel and some wire was smarter than a general with a West Point degree. It would mean acknowledging that their official tactics had failed. So, they quietly gave him a training assignment far from the front, kept his invention off the record, and after the war, sent him right back to the railyards. Jimmy Dalton passed away in 1987. He never spoke about it. Not to his wife, not to his kids. To them, he was just Dad. The man who went to work every day to fix trains. But his story lives on. Today, in modern military schools, teaching how to counter IEDs and booby traps, they still teach the Dalton principle, the idea of using an enemy as own momentum against them. Because, in war, as in life, sometimes the most dangerous weapon isn't the one that costs millions of dollars. It's the one created by a determined person who simply refuses to stand by and watch his friends die. If you found this story as incredible as I did, make sure to subscribe for more hidden histories.